Welcome back to NetTuts. I'm your host, Jeffrey Way, and today we're going to discuss unit testing. So for the past several months, we've intermittently been releasing lessons that focus on test-driven development in PHP. So in this lesson, we're going to focus on unit testing. How can we prepare a simple class using tests to drive the creation of it? Now, mostly this lesson is going to be framework agnostic. But we do need something to work with. So I'm going to be using a framework called Laravel, where we will define a task that allows us to fetch assets. So for example, maybe I'm working on a project and I want to bring in Backbone. We will write a task that allows us to do that. And by the way, this is really just for example. You could use it in your projects, but in reality, I would recommend using something a bit more powerful and developed, such as Bower or even Jam. And okay, without further ado, let's get started. Naturally, the first thing we want to do is create a new test. And as we're going to call our task fetch, why don't we call this fetch.test.php, and we will go ahead and create the class fetch test. And as we're using PHPUnit, we want to make sure that we extend PHPUnit framework test case. Let's begin by doing the setup, public function setup. And here's where we are going to instantiate our new class. We will call it fetch, and I'll make that equal to a new instance of our fetch task. Now we know that this is something that will fail, so let's go ahead and create that file. We store tasks within the task directory, so I will create a new file called fetch.php, and we will call it fetch task. Now I need to include this file, so at the top I will require the path to our app, and this is just a function provided by the framework that points to the application folder, and it is within the tasks directory, and it's called fetch.php. Now let's write our first test. So the first thing that I'm thinking is that we need to make sure that our class stores a list of assets. So for example, if we want to pull in jQuery, well then we need to make sure that the class stores a list of all of those various assets that we can pull in. So we will call it test stores list of assets, and we can run this test by doing something like this. We will say this, and I want to say assert class has a static attribute. The attribute will be called paths, and as the second parameter, we need to tell it what class we're talking about. We're talking about fetch task. Okay, let's run this. PHPUnit, and now we can get there was one failed asserting that class fetch task has a static attribute. So that's our first step. Let's switch back over to our class, and we will store it now. Public static paths equals an array. Now, if I run it one more time, great, that's passing. Let's continue with this test though. I also want to make sure that it at least has one. So let's make sure that it has, for example, jQuery and the path to where the jQuery library can be downloaded. We can do that by using the assert array has key method. So we will assert that the key is jQuery. The array that we are working with is fetch task into that static variable, and if we want to add a message, we can. I'm not going to worry about that though. Once again, we run it, and now we get failed asserting that an array has the key jQuery. So let's fix that. Within here, we will add our first option, jQuery, and we can download jQuery from code.jQuery.com/jQuery.js. Now let's try it again. Good. While I'm here, I'm also going to assign an alias of t to PHPUnit. Because we're not using automated testing here, which you probably should in your projects, we'll just assign that to a simple t keystroke. Okay, let's continue on. Now the basic way that a task works in Laravel, I'll give you an example. You run PHP artisan, then the name of the task, which we called ours fetch, and if I leave it at that, it's going to say, sorry, I can't find that method. Now by default, Laravel will execute a method called run. And that method will be responsible for acting out whatever needs to be done. So in reality, you would be doing something like artisan fetch jQuery, and then it would download jQuery and place it within the necessary folder. So what I'm thinking is we need to be sure that if they don't pass a name of asset and they just run PHP artisan fetch, we need to throw some kind of exception. So let's figure that out. I will write a new function, and this will be test throws exception if no asset is provided. Notice how we're just describing exactly what the method should do. Now we will call our fetch class. We're going to call that run method, which is triggered automatically, but as we are testing it, we need to manually call it. So here we will call it, but we're not going to pass anything through. And when this happens, we want an exception to be thrown. So how can we use PHPUnit to say, I expect an exception to have been thrown? Well, we can do it right up here within comments. I can write expected exception, and this one we will do invalid argument exception. So what this translates to is when this method runs, we're going to try to trigger our fetch task. We're not going to pass any arguments though, which is the same as just doing PHP artisan fetch. And if that is the case, we're going to expect an exception to have been thrown. All right, let's run it. Run our test. And now we're getting a fatal error because we haven't created the run method. So let's go ahead and knock that out really quickly. Run. And we'll set the query to null. All right, one more time, run our test. And now we do get a failed assertion because one was not thrown. So let's make this pass. Within fetch.php, I'm going to say if there was not a query passed through, then I will throw a new invalid argument exception. Let's try it again. Run our test. Good, now that's passing. However, we also want some kind of response to be sent to the user. That way, if they run PHP artisan fetch, they get some kind of response. So when we call our exception, we will say, please pass an asset to download. Now let me try it one more time. There we go. Please pass an asset to download. So now let's write the assertion that specifies that it should download the asset. We'll say function test downloads asset if found. So this time we will say this fetch, we're going to run it. We're going to pass through jQuery. We're passing it through as an array because that's how Laravel will send it through to the run method. So we're going to make sure that we follow that same convention. So the way that we expect this to work is when we call artisan fetch jQuery, that should then download the jQuery library and place it within your JavaScript directory. So let's describe how this should behave. When we pass in jQuery, then I want to assert that the file does exist. Assert file exists. The name of the file will be public.js. I'm going to store this within a vendors directory, and the file will be called jQuery.js. All right, let's run this assertion. And as we would expect, that does fail. All right, let's try to make this pass. The first thing I will do is I'm going to take the query that they pass and make sure that I make it all lowercase. That way, if they try to fetch jQuery or fetch all caps or have some kind of weird inversion like this, it's still going to work just as long as the lowercase version is correct. So I will say this asset, we're going to store this property on the object called asset, and I'll run that through string to lower, and then the item that they pass in. So if they run artisan fetch jQuery, that's going to create a property called asset and make that equal to jQuery in all lowercase. Next, I want to say essentially, if the asset is recognized, meaning if we have that asset available, so if recognized, then fetch it and create the file. And otherwise, if it's not recognized, we just need to send some kind of notice to the user. Echo not found to the user. All right, pretty simple. So let's try to make this as readable as possible. I will say if this recognizes asset, and I will pass in the asset, then we will fetch it. So let's go ahead and knock out that function. Public function recognizes asset. That needs to accept the name of the asset. And all this method is going to do is let you know whether that name exists within this paths array. So if they call fetch jQuery, this method needs to look in here and say, yep, we have a jQuery option, let's go ahead and fetch it. However, if they fetch an asset that we don't recognize, then obviously we can't fetch it for them because we don't know what the associated path is. Now this will be an easy one to implement. We will return array key exists. The key that we're looking for is asset. And what are we searching through? The fetch task, paths. Now in this case though, rather than referencing the name of the class, let's just run static. That way, if the class name changes, we don't have to update it in all of these methods. Next, let's write the functionality to fetch it. I will write this fetch, and this method should simply receive a path. So ideally, we would say this fetch, and then we would just pass this in. We can make it dynamic by saying static paths this asset. So remember, if they say artisan fetch jQuery, asset equals jQuery, Then we're saying this fetch, and we're passing in the paths array, and then we're setting the name to jQuery. So we're essentially passing in this path right there. Now let's fetch it. Public function fetch. We need the asset path, and we will simply return file get contents asset path. Now if we run this though, we're still going to get a failing test, because if you think about it, all we've really done so far is we've said, if you do recognize the asset, then fetch it. So we do fetch it, but what do we do with that? We just do nothing with it. So let's store that within a variable called content, and then we need to create the file. So we'll say create file. What is the name of the file? Well, it's whatever they requested. So if they run artisan fetch backbone, then the file that we're going to create is backbone.js. We'll pass through the asset name and the content. So when we call this method, we're going to pass through, let's say we do jQuery, we'd be passing through jQuery, and then the content would be the full contents of the library. Then that method's just responsible for creating the file, filling it up with the content, and we're done with it. Let's do that now. Function, create file. It accepts the asset as well as the content. So I'm thinking we may need a couple tests for this, but let's take a first stab at it. We'll say the file extension equals, and what I want to do here is figure out what the extension is of this path. That way, they can just run artisan fetch jQuery, and we immediately can look at the path and go, okay, we're dealing with a JavaScript file here. So we can do that in PHP using the pathinfo function. So I could say pathinfo static paths asset, and what I want here is the extension. So what we're doing here is if the asset is jQuery, we're looking into the array, we're grabbing jQuery, and we're grabbing its associated value, and then we're using the pathinfo along with this second param, pathinfo extension, to figure out what that extension is. So in this case, it would be JS. Let's take our first stab. We'll say if file extension equals JS, then we need to set the path to where this file is going to be stored. Right now I'm going to hard code it in, but then we're going to take this out shortly. We'll say public JS vendors, and then the asset dot and the file extension. Now this is a little difficult for me to read, so why don't we change this? We'll use interpolation here. So we'll add in the asset dot and then the file extension variable like this. And now we get the same thing. So when we call create file, we figure out the extension. If the extension is JS, and in the case of jQuery, yes it is, in that case we set the path equal to the JavaScript directory and then a vendors directory within it. Next, all we need to do is create the file. And we can do that in Laravel by using the file class. We will create a directory, and I'll send through the directory name of the path. So we're doing this as a precaution, because if the vendors directory does not exist, we need to make sure that we create that directory ourselves. So this is a precaution. If the directory already exists, nothing will happen. If it does not exist, we create it for them. And then finally, we're going to do file put contents. Using Laravel, we can use this helper class, which is a little more readable, file put. This method needs to know the path, where are we putting this content, and as a second parameter, what is the content that we are adding. I'll click save, and now let's run it. Test, and we see use of undefined constant asset. Whoops, let's make sure we add on the $. Try it again. Great, now it's passing. So if we did everything right, if I go into the public directory, we can see, yep, it did create a vendors directory, and it did download jQuery. Okay, that's really easy. Now, one thing I'm seeing here, though, is for my tests, I need a way to do a bit of cleanup. I don't want this to linger around where I have to then manually delete it. So let's do a little bit of cleanup. At the top of our test file, we can add another one for the teardown. Public function teardown. And within here, we're just going to clean the directory. Once again, with Laravel, I can use the clean directory method, and we will empty out public JS, and the same thing for the CSS directory. So if I run this again, T, yeah, that worked. Now if I go into the sidebar, you can see it went ahead and deleted everything. But now notice how I'm referencing this path everywhere. Now this isn't a huge deal for a small class like this, but I would prefer to store these paths within their own properties. So let's do that now. Public static, and we'll call it CSS directory, will be in public CSS vendor. That's where those are going to be stored. And we'll do the same thing for the JavaScript directory. And you know what? This should be vendors, shouldn't it? We'll call it vendors. All right, so now when we clean it, we can simply pass static CSS directory. And the same thing here, static JS directory. Now we can replace this. We'll say static JS directory and jQuery.js. Let's also do a similar thing for our class. So I will copy these two lines and I will paste them within our class like so. Now we can update this. Down here, we'll change this to static JS directory, and then we will add that on. So let's do a quick manual test. That's always important still. PHP artisan fetch jQuery. And now notice that it runs, but we don't get any feedback, so we need to write a test for that, make sure something is responding. But nonetheless, we do pull in jQuery. Great. So let's write a test to make sure that we do provide feedback for the user. Right here, I will say function test notifies user upon completion. So again, I run this, fetch, run, we'll pass through jQuery. And now in PHPUnit, I can say this, expect output string. And for now, we'll just temporarily write your asset has been generated. Okay, let's try that. We test it. Of course it fails because it expected this, but what it got was an empty string. So let's fix that. We can do this at the top. We run it. So we fetch the content, we create the file, and then we will echo, and I'll just copy this right out. All right, let's test it. All right, that's passing. So the basic idea here is whenever you would manually ensure that something works as you expect, then write a test for it. So when I manually tested it to make sure that it did provide some feedback for me, that's when you know, hey, I should be running an automated test for this. So that way, from now on, for the life of this class or task, I never have to manually do that test again. Now I'm going to write another test here, because what about when we aren't working with JavaScript files? Maybe we will have one for normalize as well. I will paste in the path to normalize, but now this introduces something new. When we run create file, we grab the extension, but all we're doing here is we're just seeing if it equals JS, then we set the path. But what about if it doesn't equal JS? Well, we need to either use a switch statement, or if you only ever anticipate doing JavaScript or CSS, you could do an else statement. So let's do that now, and we will refactor if we need to. So else if file extension equals CSS, in that case, we will update the path to the CSS directory. Now notice how I did some copy and pasting there? That probably signals that we can refactor this shortly. So right now my instinct is to manually test this and make sure that we do download normalize and put it in the CSS directory. But instead we're going to write a test so we can get our bot to automatically do it for us from now on, every single time we run the tests. We'll do it right up here. Function test saves assets to proper directory. So now when we go fetch run, we'll pass in jQuery. We're going to assert that a file exists. So assert file exists. The file name will be static JS directory and jQuery.js. And then we're going to do this one more time for the CSS, and we'll store this in the same method since they are related. We'll change this to normalize, and we want to make sure that static CSS directory. Okay, let's run this. Test. We get your asset has been generated, and yeah, that seems to have worked. Great. Now, one thing I noticed is, see how these are showing on their own line? That's because we're running multiple tests. But it's still a good practice to, at the end of our string, add on PHP end of line. So when we do that, it'll just make sure that each one is on its own line. Now in this case, though, it is making our test fail. So we can fix that easily. Plus PHP end of line. One more time, and now we're back to passing. The next thing I'd like to do is make sure that we notify the user if what they're requesting doesn't exist. So right now, when they run PHP artisan fetch blah blah, nothing happens. We don't get any kind of feedback. So let's fix that. We'll write a test for it first. Function test notifies user if asset is not recognized. And let's just grab one of these. But the key we're going to try to grab is blah blah blah. Then we'll grab this one right here, save some writing time, and we'll expect the output string to be the blah blah key was not recognized. All right, let's run the test. And we do get a failing test. All right, let's make it pass. If I scroll up to our run method, we have this section, if recognizes asset. Then we fetch the file, create it, and respond to the user. But what do we do otherwise? Well, else we will echo not found to the user. So let's run echo. And in this case, by the way, it's a little unique that we're using echo, and that's because we're using a class that's intended to be run from the command line. So that's something to keep in mind. All right, we'll say the, and we'll say query 0, key was not recognized. And then I will add PHP end of line. All right, so if the query they pass in is blah blah, we're going to echo the blah blah key was not recognized, and that should match up with what we did here. Let's run the test. And sweet, it passed. So for fun, let's do a little bit of manual testing so I can show you how we can use this. We will add a couple more. Let's do one for Backbone. And I know that path is backbonejs.org/backbone.js. Maybe we will do another one for underscore. And let's keep it like that. So now you're working on your project and you realize I need to pull in Backbone. Well, you would run php artisan fetch Backbone. That's now been generated. And if I open up JS, we have a fresh copy of Backbone. What about also pulling in underscore? And you also want to pull in jQuery. And just to do them all, we want to pull in normalize as well. Now we have Backbone, jQuery, underscore, and within the CSS vendors directory, we have normalize. And let's see if we try to do something that doesn't exist. Good, we get the normalize key was not found. And if we don't pass anything at all, we get a little warning that we need to pass an asset. So to finish up this lesson, let's figure out how we can use a stub and quicken things up a bit. As I demonstrated earlier, when I run our test, you'll see even for a simple class, it takes a while. It took a second just to run this class. So why don't we instead mock the request? That way, every single time we save and run our tests, we're not fetching an actual file here. So I'll show you how we could go about doing that. Let's see. How about within our setup, we say, we'll create our stub and we'll say this get mock, and this is something available through PHPUnit, and we're going to mock a class. So this is something you learn when you begin testing more. It introduces these new challenges. For example, how could we replace file get contents here if we have it embedded into our class? There's really no easy way to do that. So instead, why don't we export this process out? This new class will be responsible for fetching assets, maybe doing a handful of other things. So why don't we do this at the top? We'll just merge these together for now. We'll call it asset. And within it, I'm going to add a public function called fetch. And now that's going to return what we did right here. So I can just get rid of this entirely and paste it in. So now when the user calls asset fetch, we're going to pass in the asset path and it will return the contents. So now if I scroll down right here, we need to adjust this because we no longer have a fetch method. So we're going to inject this into the class. We'll create a construct function and we'll call it file, and that should be an instance of asset. Now, in order for this to be used in the command line, I want to make it easy as possible. So I will set it to null. We're not going to require that. But then I can say if not is null file, then we're going to be injecting our own version. We're going to stub this out. So in that case, we will say this file equals file. Otherwise, this file equals new asset. Now we can clean this up. We could instead say this file equals is null file. If it is null, then we will just use the asset class. Otherwise, we'll make it equal to whatever we pass in. So yeah, this is a little bit different because of the type of class and task we're building for Laravel. So now we have this new property on our object called file, and then we can update this to this file fetch. Let's see if it still works like that. I'm going to run our tests. And yeah, everything's still working, but as I noted earlier, we're still fetching the contents. But now that we've given ourselves a way to inject the asset, I'll show you how we can remove the need to actually fetch the file. So we begin by using the getMock method, and we're going to get the asset class. Next, I will say stub. I expect any number of calls to the method, and the method is called fetch. So whenever that method is called, I'm going to expect that to return, and we'll say, will this return value? Pseudo content. So now we've created a mock for this class, and we've specified that whenever that fetch method is called, we're going to replace it. So it will no longer return file get contents. PHPUnit will create a new class for us, and that method will return pseudo content. Now, when we create our new instance of the fetch task, we're going to pass in our stub. And if it's easier, why don't we change this to asset path? So now if this is a little blurry, think about it. We're calling the new fetch task and we're injecting our new mocked asset class. So now when this runs, file is not null, so we make this file equal to the mocked version of the class. And now when we call this file fetch, it's going to return pseudo content. All right, let's try it out. One more time, run our tests, and notice this time it finished just about instantly. It finished in 0 seconds because we're no longer relying on file get contents, because that's not something we can easily test. If I open up the sidebar, and why don't we do this for the time being, within fetch.test, let's clear this out because I want to show you what we end up with. We run test. Now we go to normalize, and notice that it's just been replaced with pseudo content. However, when we manually do it, let's go ahead and delete jQuery. When we manually grab jQuery, it is actually going to fetch that file, and now we have it. So what we achieved here is, for our testing, we don't want to run file get contents every time. So we replaced the fetch method with our own that merely returns pseudo content immediately, and that can be way faster. The final thing I want to show you is, now that we have tests, whenever we need to refactor our code, it makes for a much more pleasant process. So, to give you an example, right now we run our tests, everything's passing, now we want to make a change. So let's go into fetch.php, and right down here, this was a little bit sloppy, and I've been putting this off until now. Right now, we're repeating a lot of code, it's not very elegant, let's improve it. Instead of only grabbing the extension, let's grab all of the assets, and we'll say file. Now we can modify this by saying if the file extension equals JS, and we'll update it down here as well, then path equals the JavaScript directory, and rather than doing asset.file extension, let's just do file base name. Then we could do the same thing for the else statement, but still, what about if it's not either of those? I think it would be a little bit cleaner if we just do a switch on the extension. Then I can say case if it's JS, then we'll just copy this and break. Otherwise, if we're working with CSS or the default, then we'll use the other version. The default will be CSS. Now I can get rid of all of this. Now if we run our tests again, yep, everything's still passing. So now we've refactored our code, but we don't have to worry about potentially breaking anything because the tests are still passing. This also is a little bit more flexible and readable because when you add additional directories, maybe for CoffeeScript or Sass, you can just add an additional case there. And if we need to make any other tests, maybe rather than setting the query to null, that will actually be an empty array if we don't pass anything, and that's based on how Laravel calls this task. So now we're saying if not query, or you could run if empty query, then throw a new exception. We run it again. Yeah, that's still working. Great. But now we have all of this flexibility. If you're editing and somehow you accidentally edit your echo statement, that's okay because you'll run your tests and it will catch that mistake for you, in which you can add it back on. All right, that does it for this lesson. For more tips and tutorials, always visit NetTuts.